Hello, how are you? Here we are. I am Anthony Belzano, professor of anthropology and sociology at Sussex County Community College. And today we're going to have a lecture for Chapter 7 from the Human Story for Introduction to Anthropology here at SCCC. And you can contact me with any questions about this recording at abalzano at sussex.edu. Now, Chapter 7 from the Human Story is about language. And it essentially covers the beginning and most of what we're going to talk about with human language and linguistic anthropology. And so this is our linguistics lecture. Now, this is not going to be the only place where we will discuss language. We kind of dabbled with it a little bit already when we talked about primate communication. But as we get into culture, we're going to bring up language a lot and the role it plays in people's identity, cultural identity. Language is a really big part of that. And so there'll be some overlap as we move forward. Always keeping in mind that language is the lifeblood of a culture. Okay, great. And so here, let's get into it. So this is chapter 7 on language in the human story. It's on pages 195 to 217. We're going to talk about the differences between human language and how some apes learn sign language. It's a big difference. Apes just learn how to mimic a human in sign language. They don't actually have the capability of human language. We'll talk about what human language is and how that evolved. We'll talk about the rules of language. All languages, all 7,000 languages approximately that have been recorded on planet Earth, all are structured by the same different kinds of rules, but the same set of rules. Okay, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about language diversity and what happens when different languages kind of come together and how all of that happens. We'll talk about how important language is for who we are as individuals and who we are as members of a cultural group or as members of a social group. Language plays an important role in becoming members of that group and identifying with that group. Probably the two most important ideas that we're going to get from this chapter is the idea of encoding language, because we all have to do that. That's kind of like learning language. And then decoding language. And we do that all the time. Decoding language is how we understand what other people are saying. Okay? Sometimes we don't always decode clearly, maybe because we didn't encode clearly. So we'll talk about encoding and decoding. Those are our big words for this chapter especially. Okay, we'll talk about language prejudice. Okay, and that is having a negativity toward other groups because of the kind of language they speak. And we'll talk about language extinction, because of those 7,000 languages, probably a little bit more than half of them are already extinct. No one is speaking them, but at one time people were speaking them. Okay, so they've been recorded. But there's a lot of languages on the process. And one of the last things we'll talk about is how language makes us view the world around us. That is, language does impact on how we interpret the world around us. And we're going to go through some really interesting examples about that. Okay, so let's start with primates. And primates, monkeys, chimpanzees, bonobos, that is great apes, have been taught to mimic their human trainers, okay, and have been taught to communicate with their human trainers using sign language. And they know, and they are able to deal with an enormous number of signs. I think Coco the gorilla and Kanzi the chimp I think, hold the world record for the number of signs that they are able to learn. But one thing none of those individual chimps and bonobos and gorillas can do is teach other bonobos, gorillas, and chimps. Okay, that language, they can't do that. They don't have the mental ability, but they can communicate with their trainers. So also the only time that this is actually happens is in captivity. It's hard to for even a primatologist studying gorillas to communicate them or teach them um, signs between the observer, the primatologist, and the animal. So there's great limitations. Now, about 3 million years ago, what we know from the fossil record is what happened during human evolution is one of the very top of vertebrae, in fact, the very top vertebrae on our spinal cord during development kind of shook loose, and it started to situate itself in front of our trachea. And that is what we call today the hyoid bone. It's right there. I have my finger on my hyoid bone, and as I talk, it's vibrating. Sometimes it's known as an Adam's apple, okay, but it's right there, and it sort of sticks out there, and it moves up and down the trachea as we speak. And that was the first part of allowing us to vocalize the way we can vocalize. And what happened probably around, that happened about 3 million years ago, and a little bit sooner thereafter, about 1.8 or I'll say 2 million years ago, the FOXP2 gene mutation started to allow our brain to connect different areas of our brain, most notably what's known as the Broca area of our brain. It's on the parietal side of our brain, and it connected that with our buccal cavity, our mouth and our tongue, and that's when we started to connect our brain with what goes on with the sounds that we can make. From there, it was just a matter of getting a more complex brain where we could develop complex thoughts and ideas about the world, especially ideas about the past, the future, okay, and having memory of places where we've been, especially places where we have never been. We imagine that, and all of that allowed us to develop what we call today language. But language also required us to take a sound, an arbitrary sound, one that we could all agree on, okay, and connect it with an object, okay, and come up with a word that means something. And so human language is unique in that it allows us to give a meaning to an object with a very arbitrary sound. And so I am holding a pen here, but this could just easily be called a book. A book, okay, but we call it a pen. But a book is a totally different sound. But if we could all agree that a book is what I'm holding in my fingers, which is a pen, that's what we mean by an arbitrary sound to have a known meaning to it. And that's one of the most important things that human language does. And different languages apply different sounds to different objects that can come up with nuanced meanings of some sort. Now, there's 3 sets of rules that all languages have. They all have phonological rules, that is phonology or phonological rules, that is rules about what sounds we make. And not every language makes the same sounds. There are certain sounds that are not made in English. For example, we know that are made in French and Spanish, right? There are sounds that are not in English, okay? So those are phonological rules. Then there are morphological rules, and those are rules of meaning, okay? So exactly what meaning is given to a certain sound. Another kind of a set of rules are referred to as syntactic rules or syntax, and that is the rules about the order in which language goes. Okay, so we say the big red house, not the house big red. Okay, some languages will put adjectives after the noun. We tend to put adjectives before the noun. Now, speaking of adjectives, okay, all languages have constituents, but not always the same constituents. Okay, And when you learn about language in English class, for example, you'll learn about what those constituents are. Constituents such as verbs, nouns, adverbs, prepositions, postpositions, articles, okay? All of those are different constituents. Now, not all languages use them like English uses them. In some languages, there are no there's no articles. Okay. In some languages, nouns there may not be certain verbs used, but a noun will take on a different sound or a different meaning if it's doing something different. So, in a lot of native Australian languages, there's a word for ball, and then there's a totally different noun for a flying ball. You don't say flying ball, just it's given a different word. So nouns and verbs, certainly there's always nouns, but they may change depending on the action of the object rather than describing the object with adjectives. So even though we have all these constituents, we have to not make assumptions that every language uses them the same. Now, there's also rules, and these are syntactic rules, by the way, about how words go together in terms of making phrases, what can go before a noun or can it go after the noun. And those are the set of rules that we learn. And all of this leads to what we refer to as language diversity. And so we can see that no matter what language it is, first we have to learn what those rules are. Before we actually learn that language. Now, even though we all may be speaking similar languages, there's variations within a language group. That is, there's always dialects, there could be accents, there could be styles of speech also. Like rap is a different style of speech. And somebody may have a rap, not a song, but a rap is a style of speech. For example, in urban America or in what we call Black English vernacular. Now, your chapter talks about BEV or Black English vernacular as opposed to Middle American white English vernacular. Okay, what your book refers to as MWEA. Okay, it is a kind of a American English, but middle class white American English, which is basically what I'm speaking now. And I'm not speaking Black English vernacular. And so those are two examples of language diversity within the language group. And we could imagine there are probably several major kinds of styles of speaking just within American English. Okay. All right. Now, probably one of the most important or most common areas that linguists study, anthropological linguists study, is what we call sociolinguistics. Okay, now sociolinguistics looks at the way people speak in order to say something and say something about what their identity is, how they speak differently within groups versus outside of that group. So language will mark you as being a member of a group, or it will mark you as not being a member of a group. Sociolinguists look at the way in which women speak differently to each other and how men speak differently to each other. Okay, and so if there's no women in the room, the way men will speak, a sociolinguist will study that, and vice versa, the way in which women will speak to each other when there are no men in the room. There's so many examples of that on the media and on social media. We see a lot of that being used within business, within politics, within, even in academic settings. It depends on who your audience is. You may be speaking differently, okay? And sociolinguists will look at that. Another good example that's discussed in your text about sociolinguists is the way in which people will use certain terms within groups to create solidarity within that group. That could be topics, it could be words, it could be accents. It's the way we speak in order to tell other people in that group, I belong here. Okay, I am. I understand you. You understand me, and together we're in it. Okay. Um, and so language is very much a way in which we mark not just our identity, but our membership within certain cultural groups, within certain communities, okay, on certain kinds of teams, etc. Okay. And some of this can be done pretty quickly. It doesn't. You don't have to sit there and explain it. It could be a kind of a key word that you have. It could be an utterance. It could even be a nonverbal kind of gesture, a face, a grimace. All of that is a part of language too. We don't want to underestimate the importance of nonverbal cues. Okay, eye contact, eye blinks, rolling your eyes, smiling, not smiling, grimacing. Okay, eye, eye and head. When you shake your head in a certain way, when you speak with your hands in a certain way, all of that provides meaning, and it's an important way that we want to make note of when we're looking at how important and how language is used within a certain culture. Okay, there's a lot of observations that we need to make. Now, the process by which we learn all of this from a very, very early age is called encoding. And we are always in the process of encoding. Um, and so I spend my livelihood speaking in front of um, classes, who are the majority of my classes for the last 30 plus years have been between the ages of around 18 to 20 years old. Okay, it's a community college, but the way in which those 18 to 20-year-olds understand language is different than it was, let's say, 10, 15, 20, or even 30 years ago. And so all of those folks, all the students in my class, have encoded language differently than the people previous to them. Now, what I need to do is I need to understand how they have encoded, how you all have encoded language, and so that I could decode what you say to me in some way. All right. So, just as an example, I had a student say to me just last week. I said to them, I was explaining some topic. I said, "Do you get it?" And the student said, "I get what you're laying down." And it took me a bit of time to understand what that student said. That is, they understood what I was saying, but they used the term "what you're laying down." Okay, all right. So I get it, and that was my struggle with decoding what I heard. Okay, because I didn't encode telling somebody I understand something by saying you're laying it down. Okay. Um, and so when we start to learn how to decode things, it brings us a greater understanding of what's going on. And what a sociolinguist is going to do is they are going to try to understand what is going on in that communication. Now, sometimes the way we change the way we talk, depending on the group that we're with, or the place that we are, or the situation that we're in, that's referred to as code switching. Okay, and that's something that's really common that we all do on a daily basis. We code switch, and that allows us to um, uh, we learn how to encode in many different ways. All right, so we just don't learn how to encode in one way. And when we code switch, we're also decoding in a different way. So there's a lot that goes on. It's like, for example, the way in which I'll speak differently if I'm in front of a class versus how I speak differently when I'm at home with my family. Two different kinds of way that I'm speaking, because I have encoded that in two very different ways. Um, the other thing that this chapter goes into with some length is looking at how we use language to mark our identity. Now, your book refers to the different kinds of ideas that we learn to belong to a certain kind of group, different kind of words, different kind of ideas, the different kind of pronunciations and gestures. Your book refers to them as registers. Okay, we learn how to register meaning depending on what the group is. That is, we learn very specific ways of saying things or very specific kinds of vocabulary to show people that we know what we're talking about so that we can be a part of that group. So let's say if I was going to be an auto mechanic, well, I better know all of the different parts of a car. I better know what I'm looking at. Okay, and this is what your book refers to as, or linguists refer to as registers. That is, does it register meaning within the group? Okay, and that's an important part. So if you're if you're in a group where you hear two people who are welders talking back to one another, and all of a sudden you're going, I have no idea what they're talking about. Well, that means they're talking in very focal kinds of vocabulary, very focal kinds of language. That is, they are registering with one another. Okay, and so that's what they're referring to there. Um, Now, sometimes those registers are certain kind of categories of meaning, certain kind of categories of objects, of feelings, and there also includes in that kind of focalized vocabulary for very small scale cultural groups, certain kind of labels that you will give each other and give other people. Um, so here we are within a language group, within a culture. Everybody speaks the same language, but all of a sudden you're amongst some people who are speaking in this very focal way, okay, in these registers, and it's totally over your head. I have no idea what it is. Okay, it's like sitting next to two people who are talking about they're stockbrokers, and they are using all kind of stockbroker terms, and that's what we mean when we talk about registers in some way. Okay. Now, as far as language extinction goes, there's a couple of examples in our book. I'm sure there are questions that you've answered already on your Norton Illums that you're answering that have to do with language extinction and the efforts to preserve languages. And there's a lot of it going on among Native Americans in this country. It's pretty common on some of the larger Native American schools where young primary school students are spending time learning their native language, like among the Navajo, among the Lakota. There's a group that is mentioned in this chapter known as the Winnemetu Wintu, who are in Northern California, and they're teaching their children Winnemetu Wintu, which is in the area right around San Francisco, Oakland, California. Those people were indigenous to that area, and the Native American groups around there are teaching their children that particular language. Now, the thing is that there's a real popular, or one that's been going on a long time, is among the Wampanoag. And the Wampanoag live in Cape Cod, indigenous to Cape Cod, Massachusetts. And there's Wampanoag schools throughout, far eastern, southeastern Massachusetts in that area. And the question is as well, they're speaking Wampanoag, but is it the same kind of Wampanoag that was taught when the Wampanoag first encountered Puritans in the 1620s? And the answer is no. But then again, they were speaking English, the Puritans, but they were not speaking the same kind of English that we're speaking today. And the point here is that languages are never fixed. Languages are always evolving. There's terms that I used when I was 18 years old that nobody uses anymore, okay, or the meanings of those words have changed. Oh, I just learned a new word, Riz. Okay. When I first heard that word, I thought somebody was mispronouncing Ritz, as in Ritz crackers or the Ritz Hotel. No, Riz is a shortened variation form of charisma. Okay, and so that sound, that phonology has changed meaning. Okay, it's been given a new meaning to it. So languages are always in flux, and that's the important point. So are the Wampanoag speaking what the Wampanoag spoke 200, 300, 350 years ago? No, and neither are we, and neither are the Navajo. Okay, etc. Now, the last part of this chapter deals with what we call linguistic relativity. Um, and that's the idea that the language you speak will say something about how you see the world. Okay. Now, one real quick example would be how Germanic languages like English and German, okay, and Dutch, um, do not have objects that are male and female, whereas French and Spanish do have objects that are labeled as male and female. And so the theory here is that that's going to, uh, the perception that folks who encode Romance languages are going to see the world a little bit differently than folks who encode the language in the Germanic language. Now, the book gives three more dramatic kind of examples. That's more of a subtle kind of difference. And one is Yucatec Maya. And now the Maya are a major group in Central America and in Mexico. Okay, there's a really large group, and it's very common among the Yucatec Maya not to speak of anything in the plural. Wow. Okay, and so we could have we take the word of cups. It's never cups in Yucatec Maya. It's cup. Get the cup. Okay, how many? That's not the issue for the Yucatec Maya. Okay, they tend usually not to pluralize. So they'll never speak about many people, they'll just speak about people. This happens to that person. How many is another issue, okay? So it's usually not done in Yucatec Maya. Another language they talk about occurs in uh, it occurs in northern peoples, Inuit or Eskimo, I believe, and it's Kuuk Kuuk Theore. And among Kuuk Theore, they don't have terms for right or left. Okay, they don't situate their world like that. They situate their world in terms of east west. All right, it's east and west. So they'll speak of something being to the east, not to the right. Okay, or something to the left that is not to the west or the east. It depends on where they're situated. Right now, where I am, the east is on my right, okay, and the west is on my left. All right, I just happen to have a geographical sense of which direction I'm looking in here. Okay, and so there is no left or right in Kuuktheore. And then there's the example of Winnementu Wintu, which is a real interesting example. These are the people who are indigenous to San Francisco, Oakland, California, in that area, um, and the language that they speak, when you state something, it requires you to explain how you know that situation. So you might say that so and so left town. You just can't get away. That has no meaning, okay, in Wintu. It doesn't. You have to say so and so left town because, or I saw them leave town yesterday because they needed to get a job. You just can't say so and so left town. It's like a partial, incomplete sentence. And so within this language, it's important that you explain how you know something. You just can't say, I saw something. You have to provide the broader context for when you saw exactly what you saw. And that makes, of course, their sentences really long. So imagine if you ask somebody where they're coming from and they said, well, I just came out of anthropology class. Well, how did you know that? How do you know they just came out of anthropology class? Okay, what's the evidence for that? And so it's a pretty nice discussion in this chapter, and I like the fact that they brought that up in a sense because it contrasts a lot with how we talk. Okay, and so when people gossip, and gossip, by the way, is a real important part of all languages. Okay, gossip is used as a tool of power. Okay, it's usually a tool that has negative connotations. But often when we gossip in our society, we don't have to say how we know. Okay, how do you know that it actually happened? And so in some Native American languages, you need to say, what is your evidence? Okay. Um, and the very last thing, which is pretty fascinating, just to show how flexible language is and how difficult it is to decode language. There's something that was discovered about 40 years ago known as the McGurk effect. That's MSC, capital GURK, McGurk effect. Okay. And it's pretty fascinating. And it's been observed many times, and you can maybe observe this too. The McGurk effect is what you hear somebody say depends on who you see with your visual, who you see saying it. All right. And so you could hear me say, you could hear me make a statement like the, the very best meatloaf is made with a mixture of beef and pork. Now, if you get somebody who looks totally different from me, say the same exact statement, it's very common for you to hear something different. It's known as the McGurk effect. And so it depends a lot on what your relationship is with the person who you see saying it. If somebody who looks very different says the same exact thing, you may hear something different. And it's something that linguists have a hard time understanding, okay, or explaining. And psychologists have a hard time explaining how the brain does that and why the brain does it. But it is something that goes on inside the brain. It's a neurological bug that Homo sapiens have in their brain. It's known as the McGurk effect. Different people saying the same thing can easily be heard differently by the person who's listening. Okay, great. There's chapter 7 for you. See you later. Bye bye.